I never thought a hole in the ground would be the thing that finally made me understand why people lose their minds over property rights. But here I was, standing in my driveway at 6 in the morning, staring down Patricia Donovan from the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, while she waved a manila folder in my face, like it was a court summons from the Supreme Court itself. "Mr. Daniels, this is not a request," Patricia said, her blonde bob haircut quivering with indignation as she jabbed a manicured finger toward the well house tucked behind my garage. "The HOA board has voted, and the community requires access to your well for irrigation purposes. It's in the covenants." I took a long sip of my coffee, letting the steam curl up past my face while I processed what this woman was actually saying to me. My well. The one I had drilled 3 years ago when I bought this property in rural Arizona, just outside Prescott. The one that cost me $28,000 because the water table was deeper than expected. The one that wasn't mentioned in any HOA document I had ever signed. "Patricia," I said, keeping my voice level, "I've read the covenants, every single page. There's nothing in there about private wells, and there's definitely nothing that says I have to share my water with anyone." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and I could see the gears turning behind her eyes. Patricia was in her mid-50s, the kind of woman who had probably been beautiful once and now spent her energy making sure everyone around her was as miserable as she seemed to be. She wore a cream-colored pantsuit despite the early hour, and her perfume was strong enough to make my eyes water. "The board interprets the covenants differently," she said. "Section 12, Paragraph 4 states that all homeowners must contribute to the maintenance and upkeep of common areas. The landscaping at the entrance is dying because of the drought restrictions from the city. Your well represents a resource that can solve this problem." I almost laughed. Almost. But the look on her face told me she was dead serious. "That section is about the HOA dues I pay every month," I explained, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. $350 that I hand over like clockwork. It doesn't mean you get to tap into my private water supply." Patricia's expression hardened. She opened the manila folder and pulled out a document that looked official enough to be intimidating. "We've consulted with our attorney. Mr. Hendricks agrees that the spirit of the covenants supports our interpretation. Furthermore, as of this morning, the board has passed a special assessment requiring you to provide access to your well for community irrigation. Failure to comply will result in fines of $500 per day." That's when I knew this wasn't just Patricia being her usual controlling self. This was organized, planned, and backed by at least some of the other board members. I thought about my neighbors, tried to remember who else served on the board besides Patricia. There was Robert Chen, a retired accountant who lived 3 houses down, Michelle Foster, who ran some kind of online business from home, and Gerald Schmidt, who I'd only met once at a neighborhood barbecue 2 years ago. "I need to see this special assessment in writing," I said. "Delivered properly with notice following the procedures in the bylaws." Patricia smiled, and it wasn't pleasant. "You'll have it by noon." The board meeting was held yesterday evening. All proper procedures were followed, Mr. Daniels. I suggest you prepare to cooperate." She turned on her heel and walked back to her white Lexus, which she'd parked at an angle across my driveway like she owned the place. I watched her drive away, feeling that familiar tightness in my chest that came whenever dealing with the HOA. I'd moved to Meadowbrook Estates 3 years ago after my divorce from Sarah was finalized. The property was perfect 2 acres of desert landscape with incredible views of Granite Mountain. A modest 3-bedroom house that needed some work but had good bones. And most importantly, it was far enough from Phoenix that I could breathe without feeling like the city was crushing me. The HOA had seemed manageable at first. Standard stuff about keeping your lawn maintained, no commercial vehicles parked in driveways, paint colors requiring approval. Nothing I couldn't live with. But Patricia had been elected board president 2 years ago, and things had changed. Suddenly there were rules about the height of mailbox posts, regulations about what kind of plants you could put in your front yard, and a never-ending series of community improvement projects that required special assessments on top of our regular dues. I'd kept my head down, paid the fees, and tried to avoid getting on her radar. That strategy had apparently failed. I spent the rest of the morning in my workshop, trying to distract myself by finishing a coffee table I'd been building for my sister's birthday. Woodworking had become my therapy after the divorce, something about working with my hands that quieted the noise in my head. But today, my mind kept circling back to Patricia's words, to that smug certainty in her voice. At 11:45, my doorbell rang. I found a certified letter wedged into my screen door, even though no postal truck had come by. Patricia must have paid for a process server, which meant she was serious about making this official. The document was 6 pages long, printed on HOA letterhead, and it made my blood pressure spike with every paragraph I read. According to this special assessment, I was required to install a secondary outlet on my well system within 30 days, complete with a meter and backflow preventer, all at my own expense. The HOA would then have unlimited access to draw water for irrigation of common areas, with me responsible for all maintenance and electricity costs for the pump. In exchange, I would receive a credit of $50 per month against my HOA dues. $50. They wanted access to a well that cost me $28,000 to drill, probably another $1,000 a year in electricity and maintenance, and they were offering me $50 a month, $600 a year. It would take me almost 50 years to break even, assuming the pump didn't need major repairs or replacement. The document was signed by all 4 board members and notarized. They'd really done their homework. I grabbed my phone and called the only attorney I knew personally, Marcus Webb, who'd handled my divorce. He listened while I explained the situation, and I could hear the skepticism in his voice. "Colin, HOAs have a lot of power, but this seems like a stretch," Marcus said. "Private property is private property. They can't just commandeer your well. Can you look at the documents, the covenants and this special assessment?" "Yeah, send them over. But I have to warn you, fighting an HOA is expensive and time-consuming. Even if you're in the right, they can make your life hell with fines and legal fees. These things get ugly." I knew he was right. I'd heard the horror stories, read the articles about people who'd lost their homes over disputes about mailbox colors or grass height. But something about this felt different. This wasn't about aesthetics or property values. This was about Patricia Donovan deciding that my resources belonged to the community, and I'd be damned if I was going to roll over without a fight. I scanned all the documents and emailed them to Marcus, then spent the next hour researching Arizona water law online. What I found was actually encouraging. Arizona took water rights seriously, especially in areas facing drought conditions. Private wells were considered the exclusive property of the landowner in most cases. There were exceptions for things like domestic use by adjacent properties in shared aquifers, but nothing that would give an HOA carte blanche access to someone's well for landscaping. My phone rang around 2 in the afternoon. "Marcus." "Okay, I've reviewed everything," he said. "The good news is their legal interpretation is garbage. That section of the covenants they're citing has nothing to do with shared resources. It's about financial contributions, like you said." The bad news is they know it's garbage, and they're betting you won't fight it. What do you mean? Look at the timeline they've given you. 30 days to install the outlet, with fines starting immediately if you refuse to comply. But to actually challenge this, you'd need to request a hearing with the board, which they can schedule at their convenience within 60 days. Then, if that doesn't work, you'd need to take them to court, which could take 6 months to a year. By the time you get before a judge, they could hit you with tens of thousands in fines. That's insane. That's HOAs. They operate like mini-governments with way too much power and not enough oversight. But here's the thing, they're also liable if they overstep their authority. If we can prove they're acting outside their legal bounds, you could sue for harassment and recover damages plus legal fees. I leaned back in my desk chair, staring at the ceiling. So what do I do? Well, you've got a few options. 1, you comply and try to negotiate better terms. 2, you fight it through their internal process and then take them to court if needed. 3, you refuse to comply, let them fine you, and then sue them for the fines plus damages. That last option is risky, but it's also the most likely to end this quickly if we can get an emergency injunction. Or 4, I said slowly, an idea forming in my head. I could just shut off the well entirely. There was a pause on the other end of the line. What do you mean? They're claiming they have a right to my water, right? But it's my well, my pump, my electricity. What if I just shut the whole system down? I can't be forced to share a resource I'm not using. Marcus laughed, a sharp bark of sound. That's actually brilliant. If you're not using the well, there's nothing for them to access, and there's no law saying you have to use your own well. You could switch to city water if it's available. It is. I've been using the well because it's cheaper and the water quality is better, but I've got city water hookup as a backup. Then that's your play. Switch to city water, shut down the well, and tell them they're welcome to access it, but there won't be anything to access. Document everything. Take photos, keep receipts, save every email and letter. If they try to force the issue, we'll have a clear case for harassment. After I hung up with Marcus, I sat in my workshop for a long time, thinking. This was going to cost me money. City water in Prescott wasn't cheap, especially during summer. But the principle mattered. Patricia and her board couldn't just decide they were entitled to something I'd paid for, because it would be convenient for them. The next morning, I called a plumber I'd used before, Dave Morrison, and explained what I needed. He was out by that afternoon, helping me install a bypass valve that would shut off the well system completely and reroute all my home water to come from the city connection. The work took about 3 hours and cost me $800, but by the time Dave left, my well pump was effectively isolated from my home's plumbing. I went out to the well house, a small shed that protected the pump equipment, and shut off the main power to the system. The gentle hum of the pump motor went silent. Then I took photos of everything: the breaker in the off position, the pressure gauge reading 0, the pipes Dave had reconfigured. I documented it all, uploaded the photos to my computer, and backed them up to the cloud. Then I waited. It took 3 days for Patricia to notice. I was working in my garden on Saturday morning when her Lexus pulled into my driveway again. This time, she wasn't alone. Robert Chen, the other board member I'd recognized, was with her. He was a small, neat man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He'd always seemed reasonable in the few interactions we'd had. "Mr. Daniels," Patricia called out as she marched across my lawn. "We need to discuss your compliance with the special assessment." I straightened up, pulling off my gardening gloves. "There's nothing to discuss. I've reviewed the assessment with my attorney and I'm not complying. It's an illegal overreach of HOA authority." Her face flushed red. "Illegal? We have every right to. You don't, I interrupted. Arizona water law is very clear about private well ownership. You can consult with your attorney if you want, but Mr. Hendricks should have told you this was a non-starter. Robert stepped forward, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. Colin, let's be reasonable here. The community is facing a real problem. The city has imposed severe watering restrictions, and the landscaping at our main entrance is dying. It looks terrible, and it's affecting property values for everyone. That's not my problem, I said, keeping my voice level. I pay my HOA dues. If the board wants to address landscaping issues, they can use those funds, or pass a legitimate special assessment that applies to everyone equally. We did pass a special assessment, Patricia snapped. And you're refusing to comply, which means you're going to start accumulating fines. $500 per day, Mr. Daniels. That's $15,000 a month. I smiled, and I saw the confusion flicker across her face. Fine me all you want, but you might want to check my water usage before you waste too much time on this. What are you talking about? Robert asked. I'm not using the well anymore. I switched to city water. The well is shut down completely, so even if you somehow manage to get a court to order me to share access, which you won't, there's nothing to access. The pump is off. Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish. You can't do that. Actually, I can. It's my property, my well, my choice whether to use it or not. You want to fine me for not sharing something I'm not even using? Go ahead. My attorney is really looking forward to that lawsuit. Robert looked troubled, glancing between me and Patricia. Let's all just calm down. Patricia, maybe we should reconsider this approach. If Colin has legitimate legal concerns, he's being selfish and obstinate, Patricia interrupted. This is exactly the kind of attitude that destroys communities. Everyone else is willing to make sacrifices for the common good, but not Mr. Daniels here. What sacrifices are you making? I asked. Did you offer to pay for the well drilling? Or the installation costs for the outlet you want me to put in? How about the electricity to run the pump? No. Then don't talk to me about sacrifices. Patricia's face was now a deep crimson. You'll regret this. The board has ways of dealing with uncooperative homeowners. Is that a threat? I pulled out my phone. Because I'm recording this conversation, and I'm happy to let a judge hear you threaten me on my own property. She turned on her heel and stalked back to her car. Robert lingered for a moment, looking apologetic. Colin, for what it's worth, I didn't think this was a good idea. But Patricia was very persuasive at the board meeting. Then you should have voted against it, I said. This is harassment, Robert. You know it is. He sighed and followed Patricia to the car. I watched them drive away, feeling the adrenaline coursing through my system. I'd expected confrontation, but something about Patricia's parting words bothered me. She'd sounded too confident, like she had another card to play. Over the next week, I found out what that card was. First, I got a violation notice for weeds in my front yard. I went out and looked. There were 3 small tumbleweeds that had blown against my fence, the kind of thing that happened constantly in the Arizona desert. I removed them and took photos with timestamps. 2 days later, another violation notice, this time for an unauthorized structure in my backyard. They were citing the well house, which had been there when I bought the property and had never been mentioned in any inspection or violation notice in 3 years. Then came a notice about my mailbox being off-center on its post by 3 inches. A notice about my exterior paint color not matching the approved palette, even though I hadn't repainted, and the color had been approved when I bought the house. A notice about excessive noise from my workshop during quiet hours, even though I'd been working at 2 in the afternoon. Patricia was doing exactly what Marcus had warned me about, using her position to make my life miserable with petty violations and harassment. Each notice came with a warning that fines would be assessed if the violation wasn't corrected within 7 days. I documented everything, responded to each notice with photos and evidence that either the violation didn't exist or had been corrected immediately, and forwarded copies to Marcus. He advised me to keep my responses formal and factual, not to engage emotionally, and to build a clear paper trail of harassment. But the notices kept coming. Every few days, something new. My trash cans were visible from the street for more than 2 hours after collection. My garden hose wasn't properly stored. A delivery truck from Amazon had parked in my driveway for 15 minutes, which apparently violated some obscure rule about commercial vehicles. The stress was getting to me. I found myself constantly on edge, waiting for the next notice to show up in my mailbox. My sleep suffered. My woodworking, which had always been a refuge, felt like a chore because I was worried about noise complaints. 3 weeks after the confrontation in my driveway, I was out front installing a new mailbox that met every single specification in the HOA guidelines when my neighbor from across the street, an older woman named Helen Martinez, came over. "Colin, can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked. Helen was in her 70s, a retired teacher who'd lived in Meadowbrook estate since it was first developed. She was sharp as a tack and didn't take nonsense from anyone. "Sure, Helen. What's up?" She glanced around like she was making sure no one was watching. "I wanted you to know that not everyone in the neighborhood supports what Patricia is doing. A bunch of us are pretty upset about this whole well situation. That surprised me. I'd assumed most of my neighbors either didn't know or didn't care." "Really? Really?" "We've been talking, and the thing is, nobody was told about the special assessment until after it was voted on. Patricia called an emergency board meeting and only notified the other board members. The rest of us didn't find out until afterwards, and by then it was already official." "That doesn't sound legal." "It probably isn't. The bylaws require public notice for board meetings where votes will be taken, except in very specific emergencies. Patricia claimed this qualified as an emergency, but I've been reading through the rules and I don't think it does." I felt a surge of hope. "Helen, would you be willing to talk to my attorney about this?" She nodded. "Absolutely, and I'm not the only one. There are at least 15 homeowners who are ready to sign a petition to recall Patricia from the board. We're tired of her acting like she owns the neighborhood." Over the next few days, I learned more about what had been happening in Meadowbrook Estates over the past 2 years. Patricia hadn't just been targeting me, she'd been systematically using her position to bully and harass anyone who disagreed with her. There was the couple who'd been fined thousands of dollars because they installed solar panels that Patricia thought were ugly. The young family who'd been cited repeatedly for their kids leaving toys in the front yard. The retired veteran who'd been told he couldn't fly an American flag because it was too large. Helen organized a meeting at her house with about 20 concerned homeowners. I attended along with Marcus, and we laid out the whole situation with the well. The room was furious, not at me, at Patricia. "This is exactly the kind of thing we're talking about," said David Kim, a software engineer who lived 2 streets over. "She's using the HOA as her personal fiefdom. It's got to stop." Marcus explained the recall process and what it would take to remove Patricia from the board. It wasn't easy. We'd need signatures from at least 30% of the homeowners, then a special election with a majority vote. But the people in that room were motivated. Within a week, we had signatures from 45% of the neighborhood. Patricia tried to block the recall, claiming procedural irregularities, But Marcus filed a motion with the county court requesting an injunction to force the HOA to hold the election. The judge, apparently familiar with HOA disputes, granted it immediately. The recall election was scheduled for 6 weeks out. During those 6 weeks, Patricia escalated her campaign against me. The violation notices came daily now. She started showing up at my property, unannounced, to inspect for violations, always with her phone out taking photos. She filed complaints with the county about zoning violations, all of which were investigated and found to be baseless. She even tried to get the fire department to cite me for the well house being a fire hazard, but the inspector laughed at her and told her it was one of the safest structures he'd seen. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning. I woke up to find my water wasn't working. Not the well water, I'd already shut that down. My city water. Nothing came out of any tap in the house. I went outside to check the meter and found the shut-off valve had been turned to the off position. But that wasn't the worst part. Someone had also tried to break into the well house. The padlock I'd installed was bent and scratched, like someone had taken a crowbar to it. I called the police immediately. Deputy Marshal Rodriguez from the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office arrived within 30 minutes. He took photos of the damage and the shut-off valve, and I showed him the security camera footage from the system I'd installed after the harassment started getting worse. The footage was damning. It showed Patricia's Lexus pulling up at 3 in the morning. Patricia got out, walked directly to my water meter and shut off the valve. Then she spent 15 minutes trying to break the lock on the well house before giving up and leaving. That's pretty clear-cut vandalism and attempted breaking and entering, Deputy Rodriguez said. You want to press charges? Absolutely. He called for backup, and 2 hours later, Patricia Donovan was arrested at her home. The look on her face when the deputies put her in handcuffs was something I'll never forget, pure shock and outrage, like she couldn't believe she was being held accountable for her actions. The arrest made the local news. HOA president arrested for vandalism wasn't the kind of headline Meadowbrook Estates was used to seeing. The HOA's insurance company got involved immediately, and the remaining board members Robert, Michelle, and Gerald held an emergency meeting to suspend Patricia pending the outcome of the criminal case. Robert called me the next day. He sounded exhausted. Colin, on behalf of the board, I want to apologize. We should have pushed back harder on Patricia's demands regarding your well. This whole situation got completely out of hand. Yeah, it did, I said. I wasn't feeling particularly charitable. We're dropping the special assessment. It's clear now that it was improper from the start, and we've consulted with a new attorney who confirmed that we never had the legal authority to demand access to your well. We're also canceling all the violation notices and fines that were issued to you over the past month. That's a start. What about the legal fees I've incurred and the cost of switching to city water? Robert sighed. The board is willing to reimburse you for reasonable expenses. Can you send us an itemized list? I could, and I did. Between Marcus's fees, the plumber's work, increased water bills, and various other costs related to dealing with Patricia's harassment, it came to just over $12,000. The board paid it without argument. Patricia's criminal case moved through the system faster than I expected. She was charged with criminal mischief, attempted burglary, and trespassing. Her attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor wasn't interested. With the video evidence, it was an easy case. The trial lasted 2 days. I testified about the harassment campaign and the well dispute. Helen testified about Patricia's pattern of abusing her authority. Deputy Rodriguez testified about the arrest and the evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge sentenced Patricia to 6 months in jail, suspended to probation, plus 200 hours of community service, and a permanent restraining order keeping her at least 100 yards away from me and my property. She was also ordered to pay restitution for the damage to my property and resign from the HOA board immediately. The recall election went forward anyway, and we voted in new board members who actually seemed interested in serving the community rather than controlling it. Robert stayed on, and I thought he'd learned his lesson about standing up to bullies. As for my well, I kept it shut down for another few months, just to make the point. Then, once things had settled down and the new board was functioning properly, I had Dave come back out and restore the system. I'd missed the clean taste of well water and my water bill had been painful, but the story didn't quite end there. About 6 months after Patricia's trial, I got a knock on my door on a Saturday afternoon. It was Michelle Foster, one of the new board members, along with a man I didn't recognize. "Colin, sorry to bother you," Michelle said. She was in her 40s, friendly but professional. "This is James Thornton. He's a civil engineer working with the county on drought mitigation planning. He'd like to talk to you about your well if you have a few minutes." I invited them in, curious. James was probably in his 30s, with an earnest demeanor and a tablet computer he kept referring to. "Mr. Daniels, I want to be clear up front that this is completely voluntary," James said. "But the county is developing a pilot program to help HOAs and other community organizations reduce their reliance on city water systems during drought conditions. We're looking at private wells as potential supplemental sources for irrigation, but only with proper compensation and legal frameworks." I raised an eyebrow. "After what I just went through, you're going to have to sell this pretty hard," he smiled. "I understand, and honestly, what happened with your HOA is exactly the kind of thing we're trying to prevent with this program. The idea is that well owners would be paid fair market rates for any water used, plus full reimbursement for electricity, maintenance, and wear on equipment. We're talking probably $3,000 to $4,000 a year for typical irrigation usage." That got my attention. "And this would be a voluntary contract I could cancel at any time." "Exactly. Annual agreements with clear terms, renewal at your discretion. The county would also provide free maintenance and inspection services to participating wells to make sure everything stays in good working order." Michelle chimed in. "The new board is really interested in this, but only if you're comfortable with it. We've learned our lesson about respecting property rights." I thought about it for a moment. The money would be nice, and I'd actually feel good about helping keep the neighborhood landscaping alive during the drought. But more importantly, this was how it should have been done from the start: a voluntary agreement with fair compensation and clear terms, not Patricia's attempted power grab. "Send me the details and a draft contract," I said. "I'll have my attorney review it, and if everything looks good, I'm willing to consider it." James looked relieved. "That's all we can ask. Thank you for hearing us out." They left, and I found myself thinking about how different things might have been if Patricia had approached me with an offer like this from the beginning, instead of trying to force compliance through intimidation and abuse of authority. It was such a simple concept: treat people with respect, recognize their property rights, offer fair compensation, but somehow HOAs seemed uniquely bad at grasping it. 2 weeks later, after Marcus reviewed the county's contract and suggested a few modifications that they accepted, I signed the agreement. The county installed a separate meter and outlet on my well system at their expense, and I started receiving quarterly payments for the water the HOA used for irrigation. The neighborhood landscaping flourished, ironically. The entrance that Patricia had been so desperate to save looked better than it ever had, with native desert plants that actually thrived on well water instead of the struggling grass and ornamentals that had been there before. I ran into Robert at the grocery store one day, about a year after everything had settled down. We chatted for a few minutes, and he told me that the HOA had completely restructured its governance to prevent another Patricia situation. They'd implemented term limits for board members, required open meetings for all votes, and created an appeals process for violation notices that involved neutral third parties. You know, in a weird way, this whole mess made the neighborhood better, Robert said. People are actually paying attention now. They show up to meetings, they ask questions, they hold us accountable. It's how it should have been all along. I agreed with him. Sometimes it takes a crisis to wake people up and make them realize that the systems they've been ignoring can be abused if good people don't stay involved. As for Patricia, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd moved to Scottsdale after her probation ended. Part of me hoped she'd learned something from the experience, but mostly I was just relieved she was someone else's problem now. I still live in Meadowbrook Estates. My well is humming along, providing water for my house and supplemental irrigation for the community under terms that work for everyone. The HOA board is functional and reasonable, focused on actual community needs rather than power trips. And I've gone back to spending my weekends in my workshop, building furniture and enjoying the peace I moved out here to find in the first place. The whole experience taught me something important about standing up for yourself, even when it's difficult and expensive and stressful. Patricia had counted on me backing down, on the cost and hassle of fighting being too much. She'd used the same playbook on dozens of other homeowners, and it had worked because most people eventually give in rather than deal with the endless harassment. But there's a limit to what people will tolerate, and there's a point where principle matters more than convenience. For me, that point was when someone tried to claim ownership of something I'd paid for and maintained with my own resources. The well wasn't even really about the water. It was about the fundamental question of whether I had the right to control my own property, or whether the HOA could take whatever they wanted simply because it would be convenient for them. I'm glad I fought. Not just for myself, but for all the other homeowners who'd been bullied and harassed by Patricia over the years. The recall election and her arrest sent a message that board members aren't immune from consequences, that they serve at the pleasure of the community and have to operate within the law just like everyone else. Helen still lives across the street, and we've become good friends. She jokes that I'm the neighborhood hero, but I don't see it that way. I just refuse to be pushed around, and I had the resources and stubbornness to see it through. A lot of people aren't as fortunate. They can't afford attorneys or the time away from work to deal with HOA disputes. That's one reason HOAs can become so abusive. They prey on people who can't fight back effectively. The county's pilot program has expanded since I joined. There are now 12 private well owners in the Prescott area participating, and the program is being considered as a model for other drought-affected regions in Arizona. It turns out that voluntary cooperation with fair compensation works a lot better than attempted seizure of private resources. Who knew? I still see Marcus occasionally, usually for annual updates to my estate planning, and we always end up talking about the well case. He uses it as an example when counseling other clients dealing with HOA issues. His advice is always the same: know your rights, document everything, don't be afraid to push back when the HOA oversteps, and be prepared for it to get ugly before it gets better. The security cameras I installed during the harassment campaign are still up and running. Call me paranoid, but I like having that extra layer of protection. The footage of Patricia trying to break into my well house isn't just a legal record anymore, it's a reminder that people in positions of petty authority will sometimes do shockingly stupid things when they're convinced they are entitled to get their way. My sister asked me once if I regretted buying in an HOA community, given everything that happened. I had to think about it, but ultimately the answer was no. The property itself is wonderful. The neighborhood is actually pretty great now that it's being managed properly, and the location can't be beat. Patricia was the problem, not the concept of an HOA. When they function the way they're supposed to, maintaining common areas, organizing community events, addressing legitimate issues that affect everyone, they can actually add value. It's when they become vehicles for control freaks to exercise power over their neighbors that everything goes wrong. The irony that still makes me laugh is that if Patricia had just asked nicely and offered reasonable compensation, I probably would have agreed to share the well water from the beginning. I'm not an unreasonable person, and I'm not opposed to helping the community. But the moment she showed up with demands and threats, treating my property like it was hers to claim, she guaranteed I'd fight her every step of the way. There's probably a lesson there about leadership and persuasion versus coercion, but I'll leave that to someone else to articulate. I'm just a guy who drilled a well, got hassled by his HOA, and decided he'd had enough. These days, when I'm out in my workshop or tending my garden, I sometimes glance over at the well house and think about everything that small structure represents. It's not just a well anymore, it's a reminder that property rights matter, that bullies can be beaten if you're willing to stand up to them, and that communities work best when they're built on mutual respect rather than forced compliance. The water flowing through the pipes from that well keeps my house running and helps keep the neighborhood green during the harsh Arizona summers. But more than that, it represents a victory for the principle that your stuff is your stuff, and nobody gets to take it just because they think they deserve it more than you do. I never thought I'd become the guy who fought his HOA and won, but life is funny that way. You don't choose the battles that define you, they choose you, and then you decide whether you're going to stand and fight or back down. I'm proud I chose to stand, even when it was difficult and expensive and kept me up at night worrying about what Patricia would do next. And every time I turn on a tap and taste that clean, cold well water, I'm reminded that the fight was worth it. Not because of the water itself, but because of what it represents: the simple, fundamental right to control what's yours, and to tell anyone who tries to take it that they can find their own damn well to tap. The last time I saw a Patricia Donovan, it was at a grocery store parking lot about 2 years after her conviction. She was getting into her car, and our eyes met for just a moment. I expected anger or resentment, but what I saw was something else, maybe shame, maybe just exhaustion. She looked away quickly and drove off, and I haven't seen her since. I don't spend much time thinking about her anymore. She was a problem that got solved, and now I focus on the things that actually matter: my work, my hobbies, my friends and family, and maintaining my property the way I see fit without having to worry about bogus violation notices showing up every other day. The neighborhood has genuinely improved since the board restructuring. We have regular community events now that people actually enjoy attending, not forced attendance meetings where Patricia would lecture everyone about compliance. Last month we had a spring potluck in the common area, and nearly 60 families showed up. People are investing in their properties again, doing improvements and renovations, because they're not afraid of getting hit with violation notices for every little thing. The entrance landscaping that started this whole mess is maintained by a professional company now, paid for through the regular HOA dues that everyone agrees are being spent appropriately. The plants are native species that can handle the climate with minimal water, supplemented by my well during the hottest months. It's a system that works because it's based on voluntary cooperation and fair dealing rather than coercion. I think that's really what the whole experience taught me, that systems built on force and intimidation might work in the short term, but they eventually collapse under their own weight. Patricia's approach to running the HOA seemed effective for a while because people were too intimidated or too tired to fight back. But it created resentment and division that festered until finally, someone pushed back hard enough to break the whole corrupt structure. Now we have something better, something built on mutual respect and actual community spirit instead of fear of fines and violation notices. It took a crisis to get here, but I'd argue we're all better off for having gone through it. My well is still producing great water, the pump is running smoothly, and I get a check every quarter for the community irrigation usage. The county program has been such a success that they're expanding it statewide, and James Thornton has been promoted to oversee the expansion. He stops by occasionally to check on things, and always thanks me for being willing to participate after everything I went through. "You know," he said during his last visit, "we actually use your case as a cautionary tale in our training materials for local officials. It's a perfect example of how not to handle private property issues." I had to laugh at that. Happy to be of service, I guess. Seriously, though, the legal framework we developed for this program exists largely because of what happened to you. We made sure property owners have all the protections and guarantees they need to feel comfortable participating. So thank you for fighting that fight, even though you shouldn't have had to. That's probably the best outcome I could have hoped for, that my experience would help create better systems and protections for other people facing similar situations. If some other homeowner in Arizona doesn't have to go through what I did, because the county learned from Patricia's overreach, then all the stress and expense was worth it. I still practice the same vigilance I developed during the harassment campaign. I keep copies of all HOA communications, document any interactions with board members, and maintain my security camera system. It's not because I don't trust the current board, they've been great, but because I learned the hard way that you can't predict when someone will decide to abuse their position. The restraining order against Patricia is permanent, which gives me peace of mind. Even if she moved back to Prescott, she legally can't come near me or my property. I doubt she would anyway. The conviction pretty much destroyed her reputation in the local community, and from what I've heard through the grapevine, she's keeping a very low profile in Scottsdale. Sometimes I wonder what was going through her head when she was trying to break into my well house at 3 in the morning. Did she really think she could force the issue through vandalism? Did she think she was somehow in the right, that her position as HOA president gave her the authority to do whatever she deemed necessary? The psychology of it fascinates me in a disturbing way. Power does strange things to people, especially petty power in small domains. Patricia wasn't running a corporation or a government agency. She was managing a small residential neighborhood in Arizona. But she acted like she was a feudal lord with absolute authority over her subjects. The fact that so many HOA boards follow similar patterns suggests there's something about the structure that attracts or creates that kind of authoritarian mindset. That's why the reforms the neighborhood implemented are so important. Term limits mean no one person can build a power base the way Patricia did. Open meetings mean transparency and accountability. The appeals process means homeowners have recourse when they think they're being treated unfairly. These are basic democratic principles, but they're often missing from HOA governance. I serve on the Architectural Review Committee now, which is ironic given that I spent months fighting the previous board's aesthetic tyranny. But I wanted to be part of making sure the new system actually works, that we don't slide back into the bad old days of arbitrary rules and selective enforcement. My approach is simple: follow the written rules, apply them consistently to everyone, and remember that we're here to help maintain property values, not to impose our personal preferences on our neighbors. It's actually kind of satisfying work. We review requests for exterior modifications, make sure they comply with the guidelines, and approve or deny them based on objective criteria. No drama, no power trips, just straightforward administration of clearly written rules. Novel concept, I know. Helen jokes that I've gone native, joining the HOA establishment after fighting them so hard. But I see it as the opposite. I'm working to make sure the HOA serves its proper purpose and doesn't become a vehicle for someone else's ego trip. The best way to prevent another Patricia is to have good people involved in governance who remember what it's like to be on the receiving end of petty tyranny. The community has started attracting younger families again, which is a good sign. For a while during Patricia's reign, properties would sit on the market for months because word had gotten out about the HOA being difficult. Now houses sell quickly, and the new residents are actually excited to be part of the neighborhood instead of wary about what they're getting into. My property value has increased significantly, which is gratifying. Not that I'm planning to sell anytime soon. I've put too much work into this place, and I genuinely love living here. But it's nice to know that standing up to Patricia didn't tank my investment. If anything, the whole situation and its resolution made the neighborhood more desirable, because it demonstrated that homeowners have real power and that board members can't act with impunity. The well continues to be a source of satisfaction for me, both literal and metaphorical. I spent the money to drill it because I wanted control over my water supply and didn't want to depend entirely on city infrastructure. That independence proved crucial when Patricia tried to manipulate me into compliance. If I'd been dependent on a resource she controlled, I'd have been in a much weaker position. There's a broader lesson there about self-sufficiency and maintaining your options. I'm not a doomsday prepper or anything like that, but having alternatives, whether it's a backup water source, savings to cover legal expenses, or just the knowledge that you can walk away from a bad situation, gives you the freedom to stand up for yourself when it matters. Dave Morrison, the plumber who helped me shut down and later restore the well system, has become a friend. We get together for beers occasionally, and he always brings up the well case. Apparently, it's become legendary among local contractors as an example of extreme HOA overreach. Dave says he's gotten at least a dozen calls from other homeowners asking about installing isolation valves on their wells, just in case they ever face similar pressure. "You started a trend," he told me last time we met up. "People are taking steps to protect their property rights before problems arise. That's smart." Maybe I did, and maybe that's another positive outcome from an otherwise frustrating experience. If homeowners are thinking proactively about how to defend against HOA overreach, that forces HOAs to be more careful about respecting boundaries. It's a form of mutually assured destruction. The HOA knows that if they push too hard, homeowners have options and defenses, so they're incentivized to act reasonably. I've been contacted by a couple of journalists over the years who wanted to write about the case. I declined most of the requests because I didn't want to become the poster child for anti-HOA activism. But I did agree to one interview with a reporter from the Arizona Republic who was doing a broader story about HOA governance reform. My case was just one example in a larger examination of how HOAs function and malfunction in the state. The article that resulted was actually pretty balanced. It acknowledged that HOAs serve important purposes, but also highlighted the need for better oversight and protections for homeowners. The reporter interviewed Patricia too. Apparently, though her comments weren't particularly illuminating, she maintained she'd done nothing wrong and had been persecuted for trying to serve her community. I suppose some people never learn. Marcus occasionally asks if I have any regrets about how I handled things. Could I have been more diplomatic? Maybe found a compromise earlier that would have avoided the escalation. I've thought about it a lot, and honestly, I don't think so. Patricia wasn't interested in compromise, she wanted compliance. Any sign of weakness would have just encouraged her to push harder. Sometimes you have to be willing to fight, to make it clear that you have boundaries that won't be crossed no matter how much pressure is applied. It's not pleasant, it's not cheap, and it's definitely not easy. But the alternative is letting bullies run roughshod over you, and that's worse in the long run. The well house itself has become a bit of a neighborhood landmark in a weird way. People know the story, and newcomers are often told about the HOA water battle as part of the community lore. It's a reminder that this neighborhood has been through something and came out better on the other side. I've kept the security cameras running, as I mentioned, and I review the footage periodically just to make sure there's nothing unusual going on. Old habits die hard. But in the 3 years since Patricia's arrest, there's been nothing but the occasional deer wandering through my yard and the usual suburban wildlife. The restraining order gives me legal recourse if Patricia ever does come back and try to cause trouble, though I doubt she will. The criminal conviction was a serious wake-up call, and even someone as stubborn and self-righteous as she seemed to be has limits. Plus, she'd have to be truly delusional to think she could pull anything now that everyone knows what happened and is watching for exactly that kind of abuse. I've thought about writing a book about the experience, actually. Maybe a guide for homeowners dealing with HOA issues, combining my story with practical advice about legal rights, documentation, and strategies for pushing back against overreach. Marcus thinks it's a good idea and has offered to help with the legal portions. But I haven't committed to it yet. Part of me just wants to move on and enjoy my life without dwelling on that whole difficult period. Then again, if it could help other people facing similar situations, maybe it's worth doing. I remember how alone I felt in those early days of the conflict, wondering if I was crazy for resisting what the HOA board was demanding. Having a resource that says, no, you're not crazy, they're in the wrong, and here's how to fight back could be valuable for someone in that position. I'll probably end up doing it eventually. But for now, I'm content with my quiet life in Meadowbrook Estates, my woodworking hobby, and the steady flow of clean water from my privately owned well that no one can force me to share against my will. That's really what it all comes down to in the end: property rights, personal autonomy, and the principle that your home is supposed to be your castle, not a fiefdom ruled by a petty tyrant on a power trip. I fought for those principles, I won, and the neighborhood is better for it. That's enough for me. Every time I turn on the tap and that cold, clean well water flows out, I'm reminded of what I stood up for and why it mattered. It's not about being stubborn or difficult. It's about maintaining the basic freedom to control what's yours and to tell anyone who thinks otherwise that they're wrong. Patricia Donovan learned that lesson the hard way. The HOA learned it too. And now Meadowbrook Estates is a genuinely pleasant place to live, with a functional board that respects boundaries and treats homeowners like partners instead of subjects. I wouldn't change a thing about how it all played out, even with all the stress and expense. Because at the end of the day, I still have my property, my autonomy, and my self-respect. And that's worth more than any amount of money or convenience. The well keeps pumping, the water keeps flowing, and life goes on in the Arizona desert. The landscaping at the neighborhood entrance is green and thriving, fed by water from my well under terms that work for everyone. The HOA functions properly, serving the community instead of ruling over it. And I sleep soundly at night, knowing that I stood up for what was right and won. That's the end of the story, really. Not with a dramatic confrontation or a Hollywood ending, but with quiet satisfaction and a well-functioning community that learned from its mistakes. Sometimes that's the best outcome you can hope for, not perfection, but progress, and the knowledge that things are better than they were, my rules. And now everyone understands that.